Have you ever witnessed a moment that completely changes how you see the world? I never expected it to happen in a classroom, of all places. That day, I watched as a child everyone had labeled invisible suddenly became impossible to ignore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how one quiet kid's unexpected courage left an entire classroom in tears, including me, the substitute teacher, who was never supposed to be there in the first place. Sometimes the most powerful acts of bravery come from the most unexpected sources. I still remember walking into that classroom in Springfield, Illinois. The hallways were filled with the usual chaos. Kids rushing to lockers, teachers calling for order, the familiar scent of floor cleaner mixing with cafeteria lunch. While everyone bustled around preparing for another ordinary school day, I was just trying to figure out where room 237 was located. As a substitute teacher, I was used to being the outsider, the temporary placeholder until the real teacher returned. My name's Michael, and I've been substitute teaching across different schools for almost 3 years now. It wasn't my dream job, far from it. With my English degree gathering dust and my novel perpetually stuck on page 47, substitute teaching paid the bills while I figured out what to do with my life. Most days were forgettable, following lesson plans, managing classroom behavior, and counting minutes until dismissal. But this day would be different. This day would change everything. Room 237 was a 5th grade class at Lincoln Elementary, a school in a neighborhood where wealth and poverty lived side by side. Some kids arrived in luxury SUVs, while others walked regardless of weather. The regular teacher, Mrs. Peterson, had left detailed notes about each student who needed extra attention, who might cause trouble, who was excelling. But there was one student she barely mentioned. Jamie sits in the back corner, very quiet, keeps to himself. That was all, just an afterthought among pages of detailed instructions. When I entered the classroom that morning, 25 pairs of eyes immediately sized me up. I recognized the usual dynamics within seconds. The popular kids clustering together, the class clown already preparing material, the overachievers sitting straight with pencils ready. And there, in the back corner just as described, sat Jamie, small for his age, brown hair falling over his eyes, wearing a faded blue hoodie that seemed a size too large. While others whispered or stared at me, Jamie was arranging and rearranging his pencils, completely absorbed in his own world. I had no idea that this seemingly invisible child would, within hours, demonstrate more courage than most adults I knew. The morning proceeded normally enough. We went through Mrs. Peterson's science lesson, practiced multiplication tables, and discussed the reading assignment. Throughout it all, Jamie remained quiet. He answered when called upon, softly, correctly, but otherwise seemed to melt into the background. During group work, other students formed their circles without him. During discussion, hands shot up around the room, but never his. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement that Jamie simply wasn't part of the class's ecosystem. During lunch break, while supervising the cafeteria, I noticed Jamie sitting alone, methodically eating a sandwich while reading a worn paperback. Other kids flowed around him like a river around a stone. Not malicious, just unaware. This wasn't bullying. It was something perhaps more painful, complete indifference. Does Jamie always sit alone? I asked Ms. Garcia, another teacher on lunch duty. She glanced over, then shrugged. Jamie? Oh, he's always like that. Quiet kid, keeps to himself. His mom works 2 jobs, I think. He's never been a problem, though. Not a problem. The phrase bothered me somehow, as if a child's value was measured by how little attention they required. After lunch came social studies, and this is where everything changed. The lesson plan involved discussing different world religions, a basic introduction, appropriate for 5th graders. Mrs. Peterson had laid out a simple activity. Students would share any traditions or celebrations from their own backgrounds, connecting personal experience to the curriculum. It seemed straightforward enough. One by one, children raised their hands to share. Christmas traditions, Hanukkah celebrations. One student proudly explained his family's Diwali customs. The classroom was engaged, curiosity piqued by the diversity of experiences. I noticed Samira, a girl wearing a hijab, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, but not raising her hand. As a substitute, I hesitated to call on her directly for such a personal topic. Then Tyler, one of the more vocal boys in class, made a comment that sucked all the oxygen from the room. "My dad says Muslims aren't real Americans and their religion is dangerous," he announced with the confident ignorance only a child repeating an adult's words could muster. The silence that followed was deafening. Samira seemed to shrink in her chair, eyes down, hands clutched tightly together. I was formulating my response, something balanced yet firm about respect and diversity, when movement from the back corner caught everyone's attention. Jamie had stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and for perhaps the first time all year, every eye in the classroom was on him. "That's not true," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite being barely above a whisper. "And it's not right to say that." Tyler turned, clearly surprised that Jamie of all people would challenge him. "Whatever. I'm just saying what everyone knows." Jamie took a deep breath. His hands were trembling, but he continued. "My grandpa fought in a war, and he told me that he fought alongside people from all different religions. He said they were all Americans because they all believed in freedom." The classroom remained silent, students glancing between Jamie, Tyler, and Samira, unsure how this unexpected confrontation would unfold. "Samira helped me once," Jamie continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. "At the beginning of the year, I dropped all my books in the hallway, and nobody stopped except her. She was late to her own class to help me pick everything up." Jamie then did something that shocked me even more. He walked from his isolated corner desk across the classroom, a journey that seemed to take tremendous effort, and stood beside Samira's desk. "My grandpa also told me that when you see someone being treated wrong, and you say nothing, it's the same as saying it's okay." His voice cracked slightly. "And it's not okay." The classroom remained frozen. Samira looked up at Jamie with an expression of surprise and gratitude. Tyler seemed deflated, his bravado evaporating under the simple, honest words from the classroom's quietest member. In that moment, I witnessed true courage. Not the loud, showy kind that demands attention, but the quiet, determined kind that stands up when it would be far easier to remain seated and invisible. What happened next moved me to tears. Samira stood up too, and with a trembling voice, began to explain her family's Eid celebrations. As she spoke, Jamie remained standing beside her desk, like a small but determined guardian. One by one, other students began asking Samira questions, genuine, curious questions about her traditions. The tension dissolved into a moment of authentic learning. I caught Jamie's eye and gave him a nod of approval. The ghost of a smile flickered across his face before he returned to his quiet demeanor. Something had fundamentally changed. The invisible child had been seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time. When the bell rang at the end of the day, I watched as several students approached Jamie, including Samira, who simply gave him a shy, "Thank you." He nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but standing a little straighter than he had that morning. After the students left, I sat at Mrs. Peterson's desk, reflecting on what I had witnessed. Teaching was my temporary job, not my passion, or so I had thought. Yet this moment had affected me deeply. I decided to leave Mrs. Peterson a detailed note about what had transpired, making sure to emphasize Jamie's act of courage. I didn't expect what would happen next. Mrs. Peterson called me that evening, something substitute teachers rarely experience. "I got your note about Jamie," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I need to tell you something about him." She explained that Jamie had transferred to Lincoln Elementary after his father's death 2 years ago. The trauma had transformed a once outgoing child into the withdrawn boy I had met. Despite counseling efforts, he had retreated into himself, becoming effectively invisible in the social dynamics of the school. "In all this time," Mrs. Peterson said, "this is the first time he's voluntarily spoken up for anything. The first time he's shown that spark of his old self." The story could have ended there, a touching moment in a classroom, witnessed by a substitute teacher who would soon move on to the next assignment. But real stories rarely end so neatly. I continued to think about Jamie in the days that followed, about how a child whom everyone had categorized as no problem, meaning he didn't demand attention, had demonstrated more moral courage than many adults, about how easy it is to become invisible in plain sight, about how we often fail to recognize the quiet strength of those around us. 2 weeks later, I was asked to attend a school board meeting. This was unusual. Substitute teachers rarely participated in administrative functions. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Mrs. Peterson, Jamie's mother, Samira and her parents, and several other students from room 237. The principal explained that Mrs. Peterson had shared my note with him, and after speaking with the students and parents involved, they felt the incident represented something important about the values their school should promote. They asked if I would tell the story to the school board. Standing before the board members, administrators, and families, I recounted what I had witnessed, an invisible child finding his voice to stand up for a classmate. As I spoke, I watched Jamie, expecting him to shrink from the attention. Instead, he sat tall beside his mother, who kept wiping tears from her eyes. When I finished, the school board chair asked if Jamie would like to say anything. To everyone's surprise, he nodded and approached the microphone. "I wasn't trying to be brave," he said softly. "I just remembered what my dad used to tell me before he died. He said that small moments make up who we are, not the big ones everybody sees." He paused, gathering his thoughts. I didn't think anyone noticed me. I kind of wanted it that way after Dad died. But not being seen doesn't mean you can't see others. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. What began as one quiet moment of courage turned into something much larger. The school board unanimously approved a new peer-led inclusion program, with Jamie and Samira named as the first student leaders. A local newspaper ran a story about the initiative, featuring a photo of the two students, Jamie looking uncomfortable with the attention, but standing resolutely nonetheless. But the most profound change was one only those of us in room 237 that day could fully appreciate. A child who had been rendered invisible by grief, overlooked by a system designed to manage rather than nurture, had not only found his voice but had reminded all of us of the power of speaking up. As for me, I never did get back to page 48 of my novel. Instead, I enrolled in a teaching credential program. I discovered that my passion wasn't found in fictional characters, but in the complex, beautiful stories unfolding in classrooms every day. Stories like Jamie's, which reminded me that courage comes in all sizes, and that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. I now teach 5th grade myself, and I keep a framed quote on my desk from Jamie's unexpected speech. Not being seen doesn't mean you can't see others. It serves as a daily reminder to look for the invisible children, to recognize the quiet courage that might be sitting in the back corner of the classroom, and to understand that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the students themselves. 3 years have passed since that day in room 237. Jamie is now in 8th grade. He's still quiet by nature, but he's no longer invisible. I see him sometimes when I visit Lincoln Elementary. He leads a lunchtime club for new students, ensuring no one sits alone during their first weeks. The transformation wasn't overnight. True change rarely is, but it began with one moment of courage that rippled outward, touching lives beyond what that small boy could have imagined. Last month, I was invited back to Lincoln Elementary for their annual community celebration. The principal had asked if I would share Jamie's story again, as part of the event's focus on student leadership. As I prepared my remarks, I received an email from Jamie's mother with an attachment, a poem Jamie had written for a class assignment. The subject line read simply, "He wanted you to see this." The poem was titled Visibility, and explored how being seen and truly seeing others are different sides of the same human need. The last lines read, "Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper that says, 'I see you,' even when others don't, and that matters." I printed those words and added them to my classroom wall, next to artwork and essays from my own students. Each day, children file past without noticing the significance of that small paper. But occasionally, a student will pause and read it carefully. Those are the ones I watch most closely, the ones who might recognize the power of those quiet words, the ones who, like Jamie, might be carrying more courage inside them than anyone suspects. That day in Springfield changed the trajectory of my life. and I believe it changed Jamie's too. It taught me that even as adults, we often fail to recognize the battles our children are fighting, the courage they must summon just to move through each day. It showed me that sometimes the most profound impact comes from those we've overlooked. Most importantly, it reminded me that heroes don't always wear capes or make grand gestures. Sometimes they sit in the back corner of a classroom, arranging and rearranging their pencils, gathering the strength to stand when standing is the hardest thing in the world. Jamie taught all of us, that being seen is not the same as being known, that true courage often comes wrapped in ordinary packages, and that even the smallest voice can echo far beyond the walls that first contained it. As educators, as parents, as human beings, we have a choice each day to truly see those around us or to allow them to remain invisible. Jamie's story is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for another person is simply to witness their existence, to acknowledge their worth, to create space for their voice. In the years since that day, I've encountered many other invisible children in my teaching career. Some find their voice as Jamie did. Others are still searching for the courage or opportunity. But I approach each one differently now, not as problems to be managed or achievements to be measured, but as complete human beings with stories still unfolding. The truth is, we all want to be seen, truly seen for who we are, not just the roles we play or the space we occupy. Jamie's moment of courage wasn't just about standing up for Samira, though that alone would have been worthy. It was also his first step back into the visible world after grief had rendered him a ghost among his peers. I often wonder what would have happened had I not been in room 237 that day. Would another teacher have recognized the significance of that small, brave act? Would Jamie have received the acknowledgement that helped him take the next step, and the next? There's no way to know, but it reminds me that as witnesses to the lives around us, our recognition matters. Our attention is a form of validation that can either nurture or extinguish the flickering flames of courage we encounter. The last time I saw Jamie was at a district-wide student leadership conference. He was leading a workshop on inclusion strategies for middle schoolers. Still soft-spoken, still thoughtful, but no longer hiding behind his hair or oversized clothing. After his presentation, several adults complimented him, clearly impressed by his insight and composure. "Did you always know you wanted to help other kids?" one teacher asked him. Jamie thought for a moment before answering. "No," he said. "I just remember how it felt to be invisible. And I remember the first person who really saw me." He glanced my way with a small smile. Sometimes that's all it takes, just one person who notices. I share this story not to claim credit for Jamie's journey. He is the hero of his own narrative, and his courage was entirely his own. I share it because it represents something fundamental about human connection and the power of bearing witness to another's struggle. I share it because in our achievement-oriented, outcome-obsessed educational culture, we sometimes forget that the most important learning isn't measured by standardized tests or recorded in gradebooks. Jamie's mother once told me that after his father died, Jamie would have nightmares where he became literally invisible, screaming for help but never came, because no one could see him. The day he stood up for Samira was the first night in 2 years he didn't have that dream. "Whatever happened in that classroom," she said, "gave me back my son." As teachers, we often hope for dramatic evidence that we've made a difference. The failing student who goes to college, the troublemaker who becomes class president. But Jamie's story reminds us that some of the most profound impacts are quieter. A nightmare that stops, a hand that raises, a voice that speaks when speaking feels impossible. Each day in classrooms across America, small acts of courage unfold without fanfare or recognition. Children stand up, speak out, reach across differences, challenge assumptions, and support each other in ways that rarely make the school newsletter, let alone the local paper. These moments matter. They shape not only individual lives, but our collective future. I tell new teachers that their job isn't just to impart knowledge, but to create spaces where courage can flourish, where invisible children can be seen, where quiet voices can be heard. I tell them to look beyond the raised hands and perfect assignments to the stories unfolding in the corners of their classroom. I tell them about Jamie. 3 months ago, I received a handwritten letter from Samira, now a high school junior with plans to study international relations in college. She wrote to tell me that she still thinks about that day in 5th grade, that it had shaped her understanding of allyship and courage. I remember being so scared when Tyler said those things, she wrote. I was used to comments like that, but they still hurt every time. When Jamie stood up, quiet Jamie who never talked to anyone, it was like something shifted in the room. It wasn't just what he did for me. It was like he gave permission for everyone else to be kinder too. She enclosed a photograph from a recent Model UN conference where she had won an award. In the background, partially obscured but unmistakable, was Jamie, still her friend after all these years, still standing beside her, though now they stood as equals, both fully visible. Sometimes I think about the countless invisible children in classrooms everywhere, not just those who are quiet or shy, but those whose struggles go unrecognized, whose gifts remain undiscovered, whose voices are systematically silenced or ignored. I think about how many Jamies and Samiras are out there, waiting for someone to create the conditions where courage becomes possible. And I think about how often we adults miss these moments, too busy with curriculum demands, behavior management, and administrative tasks, to witness the small, brave acts unfolding before us. How many transformative moments have passed unrecognized because we weren't paying attention? How many invisible children have we failed to see? Jamie's story is not extraordinary in the traditional sense. He didn't save a life or demonstrate exceptional talent. He simply stood up when standing up was difficult. He saw injustice and named it. He recognized another's pain and chose not to look away. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices and most dramatic actions, Jamie reminds us of the power of quiet integrity, of simple human decency, of the courage it takes sometimes just to be seen. I began substitute teaching as a temporary job while figuring out my real path. I never expected that path would be illuminated by a 5th grader, arranging pencils in the back corner of room 237. But the most important lessons often come from unexpected sources, if only we have the wisdom to recognize them. So I tell Jamie's story to my students, to new teachers, to anyone who will listen, not because it's remarkable, but because it should be unremarkable. Because a world where children stand up for each other, where differences are explored rather than feared, where the invisible become visible through acts of courage both large and small, that's the world we should all be building, one classroom at a time. And it begins with something so simple yet so profound, truly seeing each other. Jamie is in high school now. According to his mother, he wants to become a school counselor. He says he wants to specialize in helping kids through grief and trauma, she told me recently. He says everyone deserves someone who can really see them during their hardest times. I can think of no better person for that role. As for me, I never returned to page 48 of my novel. Instead, I found my story, my real story, in the classrooms where I now spend my days, looking for the quiet courage that often goes unnoticed, creating spaces where invisible children can be seen, and remembering always that lesson from room 237, that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply bear witness to another's courage, their pain, their humanity. In the end, that's what Jamie did for Samira. It's what I tried to do for Jamie. And it's what I hope this story might do for someone else. Remind them to look for the quiet courage that surrounds us every day, if only we have eyes to see it. Because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper that says, I see you, even when others don't. And that matters. It mattered to Jamie. It mattered to Samira. It changed the course of my life. And perhaps, in its small way, it might change yours too. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, take a moment to think about the invisible people in your own life, the ones you might be overlooking, the quiet courage you might be missing. Then do the simplest, most powerful thing you can. Let them know you see them, because sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. Just ask Jamie. Sometimes the most important moments happen in the most ordinary places. A classroom, a cafeteria, a school board meeting. They don't announce themselves with dramatic music or special effects. They simply unfold, quiet but profound, changing lives in ways that ripple outward beyond our ability to track or measure. I've often thought about what made Jamie stand up that day, after years of carefully making himself invisible. Was it a sudden burst of courage? A limit reached? Something in Samira's expression that echoed his own experience of being an outsider. I once asked him, years later, when we ran into each other at a teacher training event, where he was speaking to education students about his experiences. "I'm not really sure," he said thoughtfully. "I just remember thinking that if I stayed quiet, I'd be part of making someone else feel as invisible as I felt. And somehow that seemed worse than being scared to speak up." Such wisdom from someone so young. Such a profound understanding of moral courage and human connection. I've been teaching full-time for almost 3 years now, and I keep a special notebook where I record the small moments of courage I witness in my classroom. A shy student answering a difficult question, a child apologizing without being prompted, students standing up for each other in ways large and small. These moments rarely make it into the formal assessments or report cards, but they're the real measure of what we're building together. Last week, I noticed a new student eating alone in the cafeteria, a girl recently arrived from Venezuela, still struggling with English. Before I could intervene, one of my quietest students, a boy named Alex who rarely speaks above a whisper, walked over and sat beside her. He didn't try to force conversation. He simply ensured she wasn't alone. When I caught his eye across the room, he gave me a small nod, one I recognized immediately. It was Jamie's nod. The quiet acknowledgement that sometimes presence is enough, that being seen matters. I don't know if Alex had ever heard Jamie's story. I doubt it. But courage has a way of echoing through time and space, inspiring others without words. One brave act creates permission for another, and another, until what once seemed extraordinary becomes simply who we are. As I watch my current students navigate their own challenges and triumphs, I keep Jamie's lesson close. Look for the invisible children. Create spaces where courage can flourish. Remember that the most important changes often begin with the smallest actions. And sometimes, when the moment calls for it, stand up, even when your voice shakes, even when it would be easier to remain seated, because you never know who might need to hear your voice, or how far its echo might reach. That's what Jamie taught me in room 237. That's what I try to teach my students every day. And that's what I hope this story might teach anyone who hears it, because we all have moments when we feel invisible, and we all have the power to help others be seen. Thank you for witnessing this story, for making these invisible children visible through your attention, for recognizing, perhaps, something of yourself in Jamie or Samira, or the countless others whose quiet courage changes our world one classroom, one cafeteria, one community at a time. If you're moved by what you've heard, don't just click away to the next video. Take this feeling with you. Look around at the people in your life. Ask yourself, who might be feeling invisible? Whose courage might I be missing? Whose voice needs to be amplified? Then do something about it. Because that's how change happens. Not all at once, but person by person, moment by moment, one brave act at a time. Just ask Jamie. As I wrap up this story, I want to share one final moment that brings everything full circle. Last month, I attended a district-wide education conference where the keynote speaker was addressing the importance of social-emotional learning in classrooms. As the presentation ended, a young man approached the microphone for questions, tall, confident, though still with a softness to his voice that I recognized immediately. "I'd like to ask about students who might be experiencing grief or trauma," Jamie said. "How can educators create spaces where these students feel safe enough to remain engaged rather than becoming invisible?" The question was posed professionally, without reference to personal experience. But as he spoke, I noticed Samira in the audience, now a student teacher herself, nodding in recognition. I saw Mrs. Peterson, still teaching at Lincoln Elementary, wiping away a tear, and I felt my own eyes welling up at the beautiful fullness of this circle. The once invisible child now helping to shape educational practices that would see and support other children like him. After the session, I watched as several administrators approached Jamie, impressed by his question and perspective. I stood back, not wanting to intrude on his moment. But as the crowd thinned, he caught my eye and walked over. "Mr. Michael," he said, extending his hand. I was hoping you might be here. We talked briefly about his plans. A double major in psychology and education, an internship at a grief counseling center, his ongoing friendship with Samira. As our conversation ended, he said something that will stay with me always. I wanted to thank you, not just for seeing me back then, but for telling my story afterward. Mom said you've been sharing it with new teachers for years. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I used to think being invisible was protection. Now I understand that being truly seen, the whole of who you are, both the broken parts and the brave parts, that's where healing begins. I share this not as a neat conclusion to a complex human journey. Jamie's story continues to unfold, as do all of ours. I share it because it reminds us that the impact of seeing each other, truly seeing each other, extends far beyond what we can measure or even imagine. In classrooms across America, invisible children are waiting to be seen. Quiet courage is waiting to be recognized. Voices are waiting to be heard. All it takes is one person willing to pay attention. One person willing to create space for bravery to emerge. One person willing to witness another's humanity in all its complexity. That person could be a substitute teacher, a classmate, a principal, a parent. That person could be you. So as you go forward from this story, I hope you'll carry with you the lesson of room 237. Look for the invisible ones. Listen for the quiet voices. Recognize the courage that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but simply shows up, day after day, in ordinary moments and ordinary places. Because those moments, those voices, that courage, they change everything. Just ask Jamie. Just ask Samira. Just ask any of us who were in room 237 that day, witnessing an invisible child becoming impossible to ignore, teaching us all what true courage looks like. Thank you for listening. And remember, not being seen doesn't mean you can't see others. But being truly seen might just give someone else the courage to stand. That's the power we all hold, the power to see each other. Use it wisely. Use it often. Use it today. Because somewhere, someone is waiting to be seen. And your attention might be the very thing that helps them find their voice, their courage, their way back to visibility. Just like Jamie, if this story touched your heart, take a deep breath and remember that there are invisible people all around us, at school, at work, in our neighborhood. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply to notice them, to create space for their voice, to witness their humanity. Leave a like if this message resonated with you. Subscribe to hear more stories of hidden courage and unexpected heroes. And most importantly, share this with someone who might need to be reminded of their own power to make a difference. Because we all have a room 237 in our lives. A place where small acts of courage can create ripples that transform lives. We just need the wisdom to recognize those moments when they arrive, and the heart to honor them when they do. Thank you for being here. Until next time, this is Michael, reminding you that the quietest voices sometimes have the most important things to say.